Hello, Dr. Vikki Petersen here. Last week I taped a video called New Breakthroughs in Celiac Disease. If you haven't seen it, I definitely encourage you to watch it because it truly was a breakthrough as far as the more serious type of celiac disease called refractory celiac disease. But in that video I mentioned that the researchers, what caused them to create the diet that they did was the fact that they estimated was that 32% of foods that should be gluten-free, like millet or quinoa flour as an example, were actually found to be contaminated. So I did a little more research and found the actual study that they were talking about. So what I wanted to share with you today was that study, because that one's very interesting as well. It comes to us from the journal from the American Dietetics Association, their journal, and it was June 2010. The title of the article was Gluten Contamination of Grains, Seeds, and Flours. And so what the researchers did was they took 22 different foods. They were either a single item, so nothing mixed together, so pure millet and pure quinoa, etc. And they took these single item foods, whether it was the whole grain itself, a flour, or a seed, and they had 22 samples, and they sent them in the sealed bag. They didn't open them up for any contamination from that viewpoint. So purchased them and then sent them to be researched and assayed whether there was any gluten present. And they were assayed two different ways, and what they found was of the 22 foods, 59% were truly gluten-free, and these were inherently gluten-free foods. However, 41% had anywhere from 8 parts per million to over almost 3,000 parts per million in one sample, so obviously very, very contaminated with gluten. But where the research that I cited last week, what their number was 32%. So what that was 7 out of those 22 foods actually had more than 20 parts per million. So it's the 20 part per million threshold that we use in the U.S. as far as being able to label something gluten-free or not. So it's got to be under that 20 parts per million. So a full 32% of these samples had gluten beyond the 20 parts per million. And what these researchers were trying to say was that because of this obvious contamination, it's really not good enough, because at this point what the U.S. government says is that if a food is inherently gluten-free, like millet as an example, that a manufacturer doesn't need to go to the trouble of changing their label on their food to say gluten-free because the food's always gluten-free. That's their assumption. But what these researchers are trying to say, well, that's definitely not true at least 32% of the time in the array of foods that they sampled. And of course what it goes back to is the fact that there are people who are being very diligent on their gluten-free diet, but they are getting contaminated, knowingly or not. I certainly have a number of patients who get so frustrated when they've been using the same grain or flour, and it's been fine, 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 and then all of a sudden it isn't fine. And they get to the point where they say, I'm only going with a designated gluten-free facility because I know there's times that I get contaminated, and the study proves that they're absolutely correct. So that's something that we really need to keep in mind, most especially if you are a celiac or you're gluten sensitive and you're continuing to have symptoms, continuing to feel glutened, even though you really are working very hard on your diet. So know that it is a fact, sadly at this point, that a good percentage, about a third, of foods that are inherently gluten-free and should be free of gluten contamination are not. So this is very important if you know anybody with refractory celiac disease or non-responsive celiac disease. These are patients who, even though they're on a gluten-free diet, they're really not responding to that diet. They continue to have damage in their small intestine. They can get so sick they need immunosuppressive drugs and really put them at risk for a healthy life, puts them at risk for cancer, serious infections, etc. So it's not a good alternative. And once again, going back to last week's video on the new breakthroughs, what these researchers found was that if people got off all grains, basically, other than rice. Rice was far and away deemed safe, thankfully. For these people who continue to react, getting off all grains except rice really made a very big difference. Once again, you should go back to the video because it talks about processed foods and things like that, other sources of contamination. But I did want you to know about this particular study because this contamination is a very real thing, and we need to kind of push the government to have the label. So in other words, if you go and you want millet and it says gluten-free, that means they've tested it, and they test it regularly. They have to in order to have that label on it. And it's not good enough that, oh well, all millet's fine. Obviously that's not the case. So we can push the government for some change. That would be very, very helpful. And in the meantime, just know that that's a potential liability. And please share this with others so anybody you know who's suffering can be aware, and that can make a huge difference in their health. And if you need me for anything, please let me know. I'm always here to help. And I look very much forward to hearing from you. Until then, I wish you very good health.